welcome to another episode of the Diversify World Podcast. Today we have someone very, very, very special. I know I always say that, but today is very, very special. We have Shabna Begum here. She is the CEO of Runnymede Trust. And today we'll really be looking at race, resistance and representation, not just in society, but also in the workplace. Shabna, welcome to our podcast today. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah,
good. Yeah. So Shabna, I could give a introduction on you, but I'd like you to give your own introduction. I think you will probably do it a lot more justice than me. So I want you to tell the viewers who Shabna Begum is and also who and what the Runnymede Trust is and does.
As you said, I'm Chief Exec of the Runnymede Trust, which is the UK's leading racial justice think tank. And it is the biggest honour of my entire life to be able to say I'm Chief Exec of that organisation, because it's an organisation that I grew up with. I remember when I was doing my A-level sociology coursework, I was using Runnymede Trust reports back then, and we're talking like a long time ago. So the idea that I would come around in my life to be chief exec of that organisation when I was like 16, 17, working class student in a very kind of comprehensive school where kind of kids didn't even go to university, the idea that I'd go and be chief exec of this organisation would have been wild. So I guess it kind of start with that bit. But more broadly, I didn't come into kind of the think tank world as a straight line. I actually was a teacher for 23 years. So my kind of route was definitely not a kind of trajectory where I planned to be here. Was born in southeast London, but grew up most of my life in Hackney, and studied at SOAS University, so studied politics there. Best
fellow
place,
SOAS alumni.
100%, right? So I think SOAS is a really special place, and it produced very special people.
I mean, you can always tell a SOASian though, can't you?
You genuinely can. We are kind of like up there, right? So I studied politics at SOAS, not really knowing what I was going to do with it afterwards. Again, I was one of those kids who didn't have like parents or a network that could kind of say, this is what you should do to get here. So I studied politics and then became a teacher because I couldn't think of a single other thing to do. No one wanted to do anything with politics. I didn't know what to kind of make of it. So I became a teacher and did that for 23 years. Teaching again in Hackney. Actually, most of my time was
secondary.
So teaching at secondary school, teaching politics actually. And I encounter so many of my students now in my kind of professional life, and they're like, "Miss, you taught us," and I'm like, "You can't call me Miss anymore. You're like a 30-year-old." And we're kind of peers, and we're talking to each other as professionals. But,
and was that at A-level or GCSE?
Yeah, so I taught it at A-level. So it was kind of 16 to 18-year-olds, and that was, again, a real special thing to do. I think that teaching is so underrated as a profession, and I still remember on the very last day when I left my school, I'd been there for 19 years, remember, so I had taught there for a really long time. And someone said, "Oh, Shabna's going off to be kind of at the Runnymede Trust." I was going for I was going to be head of research at the time, and they were like, and she's going to go and do some really meaningful, important stuff. And I kind of stopped and I was like, no, actually, do you know what? I did the meaningful important stuff here in these classrooms where no one was looking, there was no press releases and no big drama about it. But the conversations that I had in those classrooms with those kids, and it's true, because like I said, I've come back round to these people. They're young adults now. And then I ended up at the Runnymede Trust because I did a PhD much later in my life. I come from a background where I was the first person to go to university. I did do a master's, which was related to education. But I did a PhD much more recently. Again, like it wasn't something that I prepared to do. It was very much about my parents' migration story and them arriving to the UK in the 1960s and 1970s. And I started off with their story, and it became a much wider story about Bengali housing and racism in the 1970s. And so I did a PhD doing that, and that research kind of that I did there got me into Runnymede Trust.
So Shabna, what is the Runnymede Trust?
So the Runnymede Trust is the UK's leading racial justice think tank, and we are primarily a research organisation. So we conduct research both kind of in partnership with academics as well as kind of other organisations. And then we try to influence policy outcomes and the policy conversation to ensure that kind of people of colour, the issues that matter to us are represented in government, and that any harmful policies are kind of the things that we kind of try to resist and try to improve as well.
Is there any work that you're doing at the moment kind of speaking to the immigration policy, the migration policy, some of the harmful rhetoric and notions that are being espoused by the far right? is anything that you're doing now kind of speaking to the kind of harmful narratives that we're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, really directly. So you will have been unable to miss the Island of Strangers speech in the publication of that white paper, the immigration white paper that was published now a few weeks ago. So obviously, the kind of narrative around that paper has very much been set by the kind of reform far-right agenda, this very anti-migrant rhetoric that we've kind of witnessed since the introduction of the hostile environment through the previous government, right? So it's been like a straight line across whether it's the Conservatives and now the Labour government. So a lot of the work that we're doing currently is about trying to connect. I think there's this kind of idea that we're talking about migrants and that's deracialized, and we're like, no, it's not. No. We know exactly who you're talking about. You are not talking about Australians. You're not talking about kind of migrants from the US. You are talking about people of colour coming to this country who are actually holding up the health service and the care system that we have. That's who you're talking about. And it is racialised. And increasingly, people are kind of quite happy to step into that racialised bit as well and own that in a way that I think previously would have been kind of, oh no, we can't say it so bluntly.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I'm starting to see is this kind of rise of cultural racism, where the terms that they're using aren't as blunt and brazenly based on colour. It might be based on things like culture, saying, you know, this person or this type of person isn't able to adapt or conform to British culture or British values or British identity, which even is questionable whether there is any kind of one true British identity. So what's your views on that, like this shift from, you know, maybe in the 70s, and probably you could speak to us about your PhD as well around now, about your family and kind of the Bengali diaspora communities in London. But what's your views on this shift from words being outwardly based on colour to it being a lot more nuanced around culture, a lot more nuanced around, you know, there's a whole idea of kind of even some of people of colour, you know, people from Caribbean background, people from African backgrounds, people from even Asian backgrounds. You can see this, I don't know if it's a support for reform, but we seem to also have these anti-immigration, anti-migration views. And it's quite strange because 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, even, you know, more recent for some of us, we was the migrants that were being spoken about. So can you just kind of give us some colour around this shift?
Yeah, I think it's been, there's again a kind of a long kind of history to that shift. I don't think it's entirely new. I think the kind of biological racism, the kind of the attachment to physical characteristics has been kind of historically there. And we know that kind of it was part of the way that black people have been perceived around kind of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. That kind of biological racism has obviously got a long history. But I think we've seen this shift into the cultural racism that you described. And like you say, it's much more kind of brazen now. I think that Kemi Badenoch very, very recently was asked about whether kind of Muslims are the inferior culture, because she was talking about who, you know, people come to this country and they have inferior cultures and that doesn't sit well with us. And the kind of the interviewer tried to press her and say, you're talking about Muslims, and she wouldn't entirely say no. Yeah. So it was left hanging there, right? And I think that cultural racism piece, that idea that there are some groups that are just fundamentally incompatible with British values, with British culture, with British identity. And we saw that play out over the Asian grooming kind of scandal, that these Muslim men have a particular kind of view of women and have a particular way of thinking about how they can they can utilize for their kind of sexually deviant behaviour.
It's almost pathological, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's ascribed to them as an inherent characteristic. It's part of their kind of almost biological but cultural kind of identity, and it's inescapable. And so you see that kind of language being used. And actually, what's interesting is that traditionally there's been this kind of quite a clear line where hate crimes have generally targeted Muslim women more. Yeah. But after that scandal, you actually saw a big increase in terms of Muslim men being attacked, in terms of those kind of street crime type of incidents. So that cultural racism piece, I think, has been floating around for a long time, but it definitely has intensified. And I think people are much more happier to be associated with it and to say it. And that's been there for a while in terms of the British values stuff. Like, what do you mean British values? Because those values are actually quite universal. Most of those values are universal values. Most people subscribe to them. Why are you trying to package them as though they belong to this one exclusive group and you must subscribe to them? And if you don't, then you are the other.
Yeah.
And so instead of it being an inclusive, shared value piece that can bring everyone in, it becomes a way of othering and differentiating between people. And I think it speaks to what you were talking about, the way language, narratives and framing have really got us to where we're at now.
Yeah, and I think it's really important. I'm a massive historian, but also I love politics, social sciences, sociology, etc., all of it. But I think history is so important because when we frame this discussion in its historical kind of nature or historical terms, we understand, or should understand, that it's not new. Yeah. These dialogues aren't new. But I think to some of us, maybe it is new, or maybe it's the first time we're hearing it. So can you speak to us about, maybe this can connect quite nicely to your PhD, about home, belonging, Bengali diaspora. Can you talk to us a bit about that and how, issues of immigration, migration, race relations, issues of police brutality, state violence that we're seeing now has always been there, and we can connect it to, issues from the post-war period.
Yeah.
And even tell us about your PhD. I don't know if there's a nice way to...
All right, so if I tell you a little bit about the PhD. So like I said, I had no plan to do the PhD. No one in my family has ever done a PhD, so it was entirely new to me. I was really interested in the kind of Bengali community in Tower Hamlets. My parents had arrived here in the 1960s and 70s, and they had always told me about this kind of housing crisis that they experienced, where they arrived but they just couldn't get any housing. My dad had been here since the 1960s, so he qualified for social housing, but the way the system worked, it just did not cater for kind of the Bengali migrant community. And it comes back to your question about belonging, because even though these migrants arrived in the post-war period, they'd arrived because they had this much longer link to empire, to the kind of British Raj and India and the colonization of India. But even predating empire, we're talking about the East India Company.
Yeah.
So we're going back hundreds of years where people from that part of the world had been subjected to British control, but also then used as labour on the ships that came backwards and forwards, trading those goods and bringing all of those kind of materials and the natural resources that were being taken from what was at the time India back into Britain, and actually right around the corner from here, in terms of kind of the city of London. So that long relationship is what brought that Bengali migrant community to Tower Hamlets, to Spitalfields. And despite that long history, when you've got these Bengali migrants who have arrived in this post-war period in obviously bigger numbers then, the British state, the way it works is like, no, you don't belong here, you're not entitled to the resources of the state, and therefore we're going to make it as difficult as possible for you to get housing.
Yeah.
And when you've got kind of families arriving, and this is like by the 1970s, my mum had arrived, and these men had previously stayed in accommodation very much like lots of the kind of Caribbean community had arrived in that post-war period, where like beds were doing triple shifts sometimes, like double shifts, but triple shifts, where people kind of paid for the bed at night and some people paid for the bed during the day, and lived in these kind of multiple occupancy shared rooms. But when you're kind of single men, that's all right. But when you've got your family, it's not so all right, right? So the families have arrived in the 1970s. The kind of the council, the GLC are saying, no, you're not entitled to this housing. And so Bengali people squatted. They began to just take over the empty properties and took it for themselves. And for me, when my parents told me about this, and they were like, so that this is what happened in the 1970s. We had you guys and we had nowhere to live, and this is what we did. My parents are so traditional. They are so conservative. And I was like, you squatted. Yeah, that is not what you did, right? And so that was like an incredible story for me. And it was just like incidental. They'd kind of say, yeah, so we did this and we stayed here. And then they came knocking at our door and we couldn't leave. So we said, we have to stay. And so for me, it's like, okay, if this happened, someone's written about it. And no one had written about it. So I went and kind of did a bit of like research to find out a bit more about it, and no one had. And that's where it became for me like, well, this is the generation of my parents where lots of people are kind of passing on. They're like, old, and those accounts of what happened are going to be lost. So it became my thing of like, how do I record this community history? How do I record such an important thing where a community, a migrant community, came to this country, felt they had a right to kind of home and make home here, were denied it by the state, and then stood up and said, you know what, we'll take it and make it for ourselves. And for me, that was such an important thing to document and to record as part of our community history, but also as part of British history. That's not just like, you know, Bengali history. That's part of British history. It's a part of how kind of communities have risen up against a system that has deprived them of what they see as their rights.
Yeah.
So for me, it became the PhD was a way to do that. So I applied for and got a place to do the PhD at Queen Mary University. And
Tower
that felt
Hamlets
like, it felt like the right place to do it, because it's based in Tower Hamlets. And I had the most incredible experience interviewing people who had been around, who, like my parents, had never had anyone ask them about it. And often, like, many of them kind of were like, I don't even know why you're asking me this. This is like...
Bit of suspicion.
Yeah, but partly suspicion, because they were like, why do you want to know? And also, like, where's this going to go?
Yeah.
But partly, no one had ever given it any value. Do you know, like, they kind of were like, yeah, we did it, we had to do it, and so, yeah, what's the big deal? And I'm like, it is a big deal. It's a big deal. You did something really important, because otherwise, in many ways, the Bengali community that's here in the East End now wouldn't have stayed. It would have been dispersed. It would not have been the community that it is now. And this kind of the Bengali brick lane that we know, that's part of this kind of London cultural identity, that wouldn't have been there either. So I think they themselves, like, the world had told them it wasn't important, and so they'd kind of absorbed that as well. So it was interesting to speak to people, and lots of them hadn't even spoken about it to their own children who were kind of on my age. So yeah, it was really important. And coming back to your broader question, we live in this space where the conversation is always, you've only just arrived, you've only just kind of, you know, you don't qualify for this, you are new migrants, we're forever new. Like, I was born in this country, I think you were, and I'm still forever new. I'm still forever trying to earn my place.
Yeah, it's that ambivalence, right, of identity. Like, I think W.E.B. Du Bois speaks about it, and I think quite a few people speak about it. Cultural theorists, Stuart Hall, quite a few different people speak about it, when they speak about this kind of idea of being between two cultures. So you don't ever feel English. You don't really feel British, or your Britishness is conditional on how how you view the British state, British history. I think Norman Tebbit in the 70s spoke about it as a cricket test when he was speaking about if you were a West Indian person, your identity is based on who you support in cricket. So if you support England, you're English. If you support the West Indies, you're West Indian. But it's little things like that. If we even track back to the Euros, 2020 Euros, it's a very famous thing. I'll never forget it. And I think there was even an instance in the most recent World Cup. Was it World Cup or Euro? Either Euros or World Cup. And it was the same thing as 2020, where the black England players came to step up to take penalties, and they missed. And then the kind of backlash they got on social media, but also black people on the streets, backlash they got even on the streets in train stations, etc. And it was similar, like I said a couple of years ago, where again the same thing happened, and I was kind of sitting at the edge of my seat thinking, please score, please score, please score. So your Britishness is contested, you contest it yourself.
Yeah. And
for a lot of people, when they ask me, how do you see yourself, and this might be a question for you as well, in tying into this idea of home and belonging, I think the idea of Britishness is probably a bit too broad for me to identify with it, because that would mean that I'd have to identify with Britishness as a whole. So Cornwall, places, these fast, dispersed places where when I go there, I don't feel comfortable.
Yeah.
And so I think from a perspective of maybe my identity is London-based, maybe it is any of the main cosmopolitan main cities based. Maybe it's not a complete British identity, because when I go to Scunthorpe, for example, which I've never been to, just giving an example, not to generalise either, but you're gonna get the drift. I don't feel like I'm British there, and my otherness is very, very prevalent. So do you feel the same? Is that a normal feeling? And how does that speak to this idea of home and what belonging really is?
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, Romain, because I think that what you said about the footballers in particular, I know that feeling. I was so scared when those players were stepping up to take their shot. I think every person of colour knew exactly what the implications were if they missed. And I remember I had to walk out the room. I could not watch those shots being taken, because the reaction, and it speaks to that conditional nature of our belonging, that you only ever belong. You can wear the 3 lines on your shirt. You can go and play football at the most elite level in the most incredibly stressful situations. And yet we will still withhold or reject your belonging and you as a person as part of this community on the basis that if you don't score, that's it, you're out.
Yeah.
And that's forever. It's that contingency. It's that precarity of our identity, because we are always sitting in that liminal space. We're never secure. We could at any time be chucked out of this community of belonging. And I think that's such a horrible place to be in many ways, but it's also a place of creativity. And I think that one of the other things that you were saying about that, therefore, we make our identity in different ways. And I think that, like, again, I do probably say I think I describe myself as British Bangladeshi. I'm just used to ticking those boxes and kind of saying that about myself. But my identity is so much more about then I'm Muslim, I'm Bangladeshi, I'm British, I'm a mum, I live in Walthamstow. Like, you know, there are lots of concentric zones, some of them overlapping, some of them that sit in tension, that kind of describe me. I would never say I'm English, though. That's one thing. I feel is a very, very kind of narrow idea, and I would never kind of think of myself in that way. So yeah, I think that precarity of identity is something that can also be a space of creativity. Often we have to do it because we're not permitted to have the identity in a kind of generous or kind of secure way. Yeah,
and I think in that, even when you look at art forms, you look at music, when you look at how, and there's a really good book by Ambhavana Sivanandan, and he speaks about communities of resistance and how these communities, different communities, you know, communities from different ethnic backgrounds had come together. And this is probably another question that I would like to ask you, but just giving some context. In the 70s, 80s, came together and had to band together to create these communities of resistance. And what they did, how they had to kind of demand justice, demand freedom, demand equality, demand a rethinking of their own identity. And it seems like now the communities are very, very much more fragmented. And there might be many reasons for that. Maybe you can give us shed some light on the reasons for that. But yeah, it just seems like back then, maybe because of necessity and need, communities came together and had to come together. And now we're a bit more autonomous, a bit more, I'm going to do this my way, you're going to do this your way. There's issues that are specifically issues related to this particular ethnic group. Because I'm not from that ethnic group, I don't care, I'm not going to get involved. Like, what happened and how did we get back there?
Yeah, so I think you're right. I think there are kind of cadences in how we've kind of thought about ourselves and kind of the way in which we've connected our struggles. So I think that what you're probably referring to there is the idea of political blackness, right? And so my PhD was very much focused on the 1970s and in particular in that period, the Bengali squatter movement was very much about Bengali community in East London demanding the right to home and taking it for themselves. But they described themselves as black at the time. So the placards that they used, and when they were kind of on demonstrations, they were talking about homes for black people.
So because we know what political blackness is, but for some viewers who maybe it's the first time they've ever heard of political blackness. Sorry to interject, but can you just tell us, as well as that, but tell us what political blackness is?
Yes, so political blackness, I guess, like, you know, it's kind of a broad term which is used to describe the idea that people of colour, like whether they were from the kind of Caribbean diaspora or from kind of the African diaspora, but also from South Asian kind of diasporic communities, that all of these communities had some connection in terms of their kind of connection to empire and imperial struggle. So there was something about kind of race, there was something about empire, there was also something about class there as well. So political blackness kind of was a term that was used to describe the kind of commonality of experience that all of these groups had. And so, like I said, the Bengali squatters many of them described themselves as black. And one of the other organisations that was pivotal at the time was the Race Today Collective.
Yes.
And so the Race Today Collective were a group that were connected to kind of the Black Panther movement and had this idea of kind of an international global struggle. And that's, again, the political blackness piece was also kind of very much looking at imperialism, not just as a past struggle, but kind of the legacies and the continued kind of persistence of imperial kind of power in even the post-war period and in the post kind of independence period. So the Race Today Collective as an organisation was people like Darcus Howe, who we know from kind of the Mangrove Nine, and you had Farouk Dondi and Mala Sen.
Yeah.
These were kind of
they were in the Black Panther Party.
Yeah,
as well,
exactly.
weren't
So they were in they were in part of the Black Panther Party, and then they formed what was called the Race Today Collective, and they saw themselves as both intellectuals but also people that wanted to be connected to communities. And so they brought that kind of the political blackness kind of intellectual thought to apply to and support the actual people on the ground, because they were like, there's no point writing articles and papers if it doesn't connect to the actual struggles that people are having on the streets.
I agree. Yeah.
So they kind of help to frame the struggle, help to kind of turn it from groups and individuals who are squatting into, let's think about how we build this as a collective piece and connect it up. I think we had a period in the 1970s where, because, like you say, of some of those kind of post-war conditions, arrival, migrant experience, the nature of the jobs that people are doing, the nature of the housing situation they faced, the nature of the kind of policing that they kind of confronted as well. Some of those were very shared experiences. They were obviously different as well, but there was enough there for people to kind of see that actually we need to kind of build these communities of resistance and see the kind of the way in which we need to confront these together. So political blackness was this very kind of strong sense that we need to find solidarity in our struggles and see them as connected and see your struggle as my struggle.
Yeah.
I think, but by the 1980s, we begin to have a shift. We have kind of, and this is contested, by the way, so different people have very different views on what changed. And also not to romanticize the 70s and to say that everyone was like holding hands and saying, yeah, we're all happy together and let's fight this racism together. I don't think that was the case. And I think that, like, you know, it's really important not to kind of paint it as rainbows and unicorns and everyone was happy.
Yeah.
Obviously, people had their differences. But I think by the 90s, but there was enough there for people to feel like, yes, it's worth us working together. And I think that by the 1980s, you've got a kind of a system where like the local councils and the government are beginning to give out grants
Funding
and things to community groups and say, all right, well, you're telling us that you've got these issues. Well, apply for funding. You can set this up and you can set this project up and we'll kind of support you. And when you start funneling your activism into kind of quite institutionalized funding streams, applications that are kind of regulated by either the local council or indeed kind of the
GLC,
government, or a GLC, then you're beginning to have to make your case in a different way, and you're having to also say why your cause is more important. And I think that we have had a shift into much more kind of identity-based politics, which was about this is my specific need, this is why I need you to fund me. And I think that caused some of the fracturing. But I think that there has always been tensions because our experience is different. You as a young black man will have a very different experience of racism to me as an older Muslim brown woman, right? And so I think that's obvious, and lots of people felt and have always felt that those differences are so big that we can't pretend that they're all the same. I've always felt differently.
And I think that's a great point about the funding, but there's also another point about the state operating specific policies to different communities. So, for example, in the South Asian sense, immigration was a big thing. Like, immigration was a thing. You'd have, routinely have immigration officers, harassing South Asian workers at work or at homes in the community, etc. It was a routine. But in the black community, and I'm not saying that these were siloed either. So there was obviously the cross connection between the two, and both would be affected by the differences. But I think from a perspective of the Asian community being really targeted from an immigration perspective or by immigration officers, but from the black community, particularly Caribbean community, it was the police. And I think you've done some studies about policing in schools and policing. And even when we draw up on, I think our initial conversation we were speaking about the riots of 2011 and looking at, was the riots in 2011 a connection to age-old policies of over-policing, of discriminate policing, coercive policing, etc. Can you speak to us a little bit about that, and has it changed or is it the same?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point that you make, Romain, about the kind of the different experiences of kind of state violence and state harm on communities, because it hasn't been the same for all communities, and it has often been very targeted and specific. And that immigration piece versus the over-policing piece, and you mentioned Stuart Hall before, and kind of, policing the crisis and the black mugger, that kind of racialized trope of kind of the aggressive black male, is so pervasive and was so much part of kind of how policing has built up the kind of range of different powers it's been given and how it's deployed them. And like you say, that deployment continues to today. And in terms of you asked before about Runnymede Trust in terms of our kind of policy influencing, police powers and the kind of aggressive and excessive use of police powers against black communities in particular has been something that we have kind of researched and kind of written about for a really, really long time. And those riots that you kind of described, again, like we're talking about kind of communities that have been over-policed for generations, and the response to it was Mark Duggan, right? And the killing of Mark Duggan. It's both a reaction to the killing of Mark Duggan, but also the wider conditions that people live in, right? Because the areas that were affected by the uprisings, the riots, however you want to call them, are about people who have not only lost trust in kind of the police and the police as an institution, but who actually have nothing given to them by the other parts of kind of the social contract in terms of education, in terms of kind of the conditions, the material conditions people live in. So I think that is always the case, that what we see is that where people need kind of, it's their material needs are not being met, and then instead of kind of the material needs being met, you just see an excess of policing powers and repression of those communities, and those two things collide. And that's what happens, is that actually where people feel unfairly policed, and not just feel it, are unfairly policed, then that is the reaction that you're going to get. And we keep talking about kind of trust and rebuilding trust, but actually we know that you can't rebuild trust. You can't rebuild trust that's never been there, because policing has operated in such an aggressive way for so long.
Yeah, and when we think about policing, I think we have to draw the connections to empire, right? So when we look at the policing methods in the 60s and the 70s, these were methods, coercive policing methods, like saturation policing, coercive policing, that were led by people like, I think, Commissioner Robert Mark and quite a few other commissioners who they trained in the colonies. Now, they had training in Ireland and in Palestine and in Cyprus. So a lot of the methods that were used in the colonies, in certain colonies in certain parts of the world, in conflict zones, were brought back here to police the communities here. So I think it's really important that the legacy of those policing methods that we still feel now, we have to understand and draw it to like a wider context of policing the empire. And it's funny that you say what you said about kind of communities that never had trust in the police, because I think some of these communities saw police as an extension of their experiences back home, right? So the police is the new Babylon, for example, as Linton Kwesi Johnson had a really important poem talking about the Brixton riots and Swamp 81 and how that's the kind of modern representation of Babylon. A question that I wanted to ask you as well is, you mentioned Stuart Hall's book, Police in the Crisis, and in the 70s, the creation of this black mugger, and how, the creation of this black mugger led to some of these kind of over-policing methods. Fast forward 30 years, we had this quote-unquote war on terror, and 2003 Terrorism Act, and how that continuation of policing or creating a crisis continued, also shift slightly. So now there is a different quote-unquote mugger, not a mugger in a sense, but a terrorist, and how these words are very loaded with colour and race. So the mugger is loaded with colour and race, but now the terrorist is loaded with colour and race. And it's quite interesting that we had at the Liverpool parade where the press and the police were very, very quick to say, actually, hey, it's not a Muslim, it's not a terrorist, it was a white man. Now they're saying he was a family man. What can we take away from these shifts in perception of the mugger and the terrorist, and how now the different crises have been created and how that impacts kind of ideas of Islamophobia and the fear of Islam, the fear of Muslims, and how it's very, very, very related and coded to colour.
I think that's it's a really big question, but like it's a really good question. But like that whole the black mugger, the moral panic that was created around kind of the idea of the black mugger, where Stuart Hall kind of writes about it. There was no spike in crimes. It was there was a particular lull in the kind of news agenda, and it just became a story. So like there wasn't this new sudden kind of rash of kind of black men going out and kind of robbing people on the streets. That wasn't actually even the case.
And it was the first time the word mugging was actually used, wasn't it?
So it was the creation of an actual term to describe a particular group of people. It got caught up in the media. And this is, I think, the really important point that we kind of need to address is the connection between kind of politics and media and how they're interactive and how they kind of reinforce each other. And so you're absolutely right that the kind of the mugger, the moral panic that was created that Stuart Hall describes is kind of recycled again and comes back around. As Stuart Hall kind of says, it will always happen because racism does that. It finds kind of translates itself to whatever new kind of othering it wants to kind of perform and deploy. And so we've got, as you say, the war on terror and Islamophobia, and the Muslim, in particular, the kind of the Muslim man at that early stage is the extremist, is the threat, is this kind of aggressive security threat.
Yeah.
And you know, all of the kind of the policies that come out, the attempt to have this 90-day detention for people who are suspected.
Schedule 7.
Yeah. Which was wild, right? Like, you know, to kind of be able to detain someone on suspicion of a crime for 90 days. Like you use a kind of a perceived or a manufactured threat to really erode the rights, not just of that particular group of people, but at a kind of really quite fundamental level. Yeah. And this is why I think it's really important that it's not just about us fighting for our kind of specific rights. Actually, if that had been introduced and if that had been succeeded, that could have been applied to kind of anyone, like, you know, and that would have been a fundamental breach of our rights to be able to do that. And it nearly made it as a policy. So it's how the state deploys that, creates and manufactures a threat, and then kind of can secure all sorts of kind of quite regressive and repressive powers for itself in order to so-called keep the peace. But I think it's really interesting how the kind of the Islamophobia, and we've seen that kind of become such a kind of a loud and angry kind of part of our political conversation now. Yeah. And that whole Liverpool thing that you described, the police knew what could potentially happen if it got out, like the Southport murders. Yeah, that if there was a hint that this might be a brown Muslim person, then we would see a repeat of those riots where thousands of people went out on the streets and literally tried to burn people who were seeking asylum in this country alive in a hotel. So the police kind of took that preemptive action on this in this case to say, like, it's nothing to do with that, because they know how little it takes to trigger that kind of violence now, because we've been set up to do that hating.
But almost, but to an extent almost overcompensating in a way where some of the new headlines today was like he was a loving family man. Yeah. And I'm not sure what that means. Yeah. I want a question that I had a point that I wanted to make as well about the Schedule 7 and the 90-day detention. And I've probably never spoken about this to anyone. I think maybe a couple of people know. But I think when you look at a law or a policy like that and then compare it to the SUS laws of kind of earlier, or even Section 60, and, you know, which is still around now, and other policies, what they do, they're meant to create fear in the community. So the SUS laws, which was a reenactment of the Vagrancy Act, it's supposed to, so they could detain, charge, stop anyone they were suspicious of committing a crime or about to commit a crime or had the intention to commit a crime. So what you had was hundreds, thousands of people being stopped, being searched, some being convicted. But it's the fear that it brings into the community. And I think Schedule 7 and the whole Terrorism Act is very, very similar. It's the fear that you could be stopped, detained, searched, and just based on mere suspicion. But I think when I checked it a couple of weeks ago, they don't have to have a suspicion, right? And I think there was an incident that happened to me when I was 22, 23. I was trying to travel to America, and I was stopped under that and detained. This was in Southampton. It was supposed to be a cruise. I've never spoken about it. Definitely never spoken about it on like camera, because I was scared. I was 22 years old. And I remember being taken down. I was in there for about 7 or 8 hours, detained. Everything searched, questioned, interrogated, good cop, bad cop, asked about what's the 5 pillars of Islam, what do you think about Buddhists, Jews, Christians? And it was based on the fact that they said I had a suspicious profile because I changed my name to an Arabic name, just like how Malcolm X changed his name because that was my idol, just like how he changed his name to Al-Malik al-Shabazz, kind of renouncing his slave name. And I studied in Egypt for about 4 months, just before the London riots. I think I got back the day before the London riots started. So just because of those two things. And I remember them saying that if they think that I'm withholding information or I'm not answering the question in a way that is acceptable to them, I could be detained for 2 weeks. And there was a room downstairs somewhere. No one knew I was there. There was no windows, just a room, 2 strange men that I didn't know. And that created fear in me because I was like, I hadn't done anything, but just based on a suspicious profile, quote unquote suspicious profile, this could my freedom, my liberty could be taken away. So when I hear about other situations like sus laws and this and that, it really resonates with me because it's like, well, that happened to me, but just in a different way, in a different time, and under a different policy or schedule.
I'm so sorry that happened to you.
Yeah.
Right?
Me too.
And that's like that haunts you, right?
It does. Yeah. Even now I'm getting a bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, I can just hear you and how you kind of said that you've never shared it.
Definitely not on camera.
Yeah, that's one of those things that sits with you and haunts you in a way that I don't think those 2 police officers or whoever they were will ever appreciate what it leaves and the scars that it leaves in a human being to be kind of subjected to that kind of state power where you actually think that, I could disappear in this room no one will know, and I'm not able to contact anyone, and this is perfectly fine for the state to do it, and it's on this completely random kind of so-called suspicion of these kind of what they think to be suspicious kind of facts. It's incredible, right? And this is the thing that, like, this is the bit where kind of if you are generally a white person of middle class background, you are very unlikely to ever experience the state in such a terrifying and direct way, and therefore you assume that the state is this benevolent, generally all right kind of system, and actually never being kind of able to see or appreciate what it feels like to be the kind of a young man experiencing what you did. And I think that this is where kind of like just what you just said, I think it's so important for people to hear and know about these experiences, because even if they're small, they are significant, right?
And it takes you a while to, 100% significant, and it takes you a while to get the courage to speak about it. And because, you might fear repression, like some reprisal, or you might fear, okay, this might happen to me if I try to go to America again, or
or that maybe I'd like people associate that something I did do something wrong, or there was something a bit iffy about me, and so then you kind of feel like, okay, well, let me just not talk about it at all, because I just want to kind of sanitize myself of that whole thing. But
So how do we? Couple of questions before we close. It's been a great conversation, and I think talking about these topics we could always go on for hours and hours, and maybe we need to do a number 2. I don't know. But before we end, I want to answer a couple of questions. We've spoken about media, Stuart Hall's representation theory, Islamophobia. How do we challenge the media's portrayals of Islamophobia, or the media portrayal of what it is to be an Asian, brown woman or man? How do we challenge that perception?
Yeah, I think there's there's different schools of thought on this, right? And I think that there are some people who want to do this kind of whole project ourselves as like these good charitable people,
model citizens.
Model citizens, like the model minority that we work hard and
the good immigrant.
The good immigrant whole thing. Yeah, and I'm not up for that. I'm just like, do you know what? no, I don't, it comes back to that kind of precarity and that conditionality. And I'm like, no, I reject your imposing that on me, because actually, regardless of whether I was born and brought up here, but regardless of whether I was born and brought up here, people are entitled to basic human rights, regardless of whether they're good or bad, right? And so for me, I think we need to be able to get to a place where we don't have to kind of do this overexertion of like, no, we're really good, and we do X, Y, and Z to prove our validity, to prove our worthiness, because then that buys into the narrative that some people are worthy and deserving and other people aren't. Yeah. And so you kind of accept that term of reference. So for me, I kind of feel like you're doing the work, Romain, just like creating different spaces where we can speak about our work, who we are, on our own terms without having to do the good immigrant kind of representation stuff. And I guess coming back to the Runnymede Trust, we do a lot of work around education. Yeah. And so like, how do we represent who we are? Well, actually, education is one of the biggest spaces where we are taught about who we are. And currently, the education system is very monocultural. We had a Conservative government that, in particular, kind of tried really hard to erase any connection to empire apart from celebrating it. And so I think that often we think about representation in terms of media and big kind of public kind of pieces, but I think the quieter but actually more important space is the education space, and where children and young people are exposed to who and what Britain is. And coming back to the thing that we started with in terms of like Britain as an island and who belongs and who doesn't. We've always had a connection. You mentioned Sivanandan, right? We're here because you were there.
Of course, yeah.
That history should be something that is just a normal part of our history curriculum. Not Black History Month, but it's just British history.
Standard.
It's standard British history because that's what it is, right? And like when we teach arts, we did a whole research project recently on art, and only like 2.8% of artists that appear in the GCSE art curriculum are Black or South Asian. But actually, we have made major contributions to British art, and we're not represented there. Yeah. So again, there are kind of like normalise the fact that Britain is a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial kind of space, and has been for a really long time.
I would say always has been.
Yeah.
I'd say always has been. One of our most popular lectures that we give is called Redefining Narratives, and it basically traces Britain's racially diverse past to about 40,000 years ago. Yeah, the Red Lady of Paverland, and then you move on to Cheddar Man, and then other people, White Hawk Woman, and other like prehistoric individuals who, when they've radiocarbon dated, when they've done like genetic reconstructions of them, they look completely different to what a quote unquote Anglo-Saxon person would look like. But even the term Anglo-Saxon, as we know, it's from Angles and Saxons, not from here. So I think it's definitely part of a nation building construction of the way history is taught, because history is always taught from 1066 and the kind of creation of what we now know as the kind of modern kingdom of England, right? It's not taught from before that, because that will somehow kind of deconstruct this idea of nation, empire, being homogenous and being connected to kind of whiteness, etc. So what can we do? What can individuals do? What can community groups do? What can workplaces do? What can we do to further these conversations? What can we do to not make, I guess, this trajectory of this conversation that we're having kind of die out? What can we do?
Again, a really good point. And what you just described there around that really long history, I think that going back to the racist riots quickly, one of the slogans that was chanted is, "We want our country back." What do you mean you want your country back? What country is it that you imagine? And it's the imagined kind of community, which is of this white kind of homogenous monocultural community that never actually existed, as you said. And so I think, again, right at the top, you talked about the immigration white paper and this idea that migration is a problem, and that kind of we've got to limit it. And even that Black and kind of South Asian communities, people of colour, have now absorbed some of that, right? That's what you were saying, is that somehow we, even us who were once subjected to that, are now beginning to say, oh yeah, we do, it's time to shut the door and kind of. And so in a way, the answer to your question is about kind of, it's such a powerful and compelling logic that we're taught about migration, migrants, who belongs, that even us who have experienced racism in this country, can still be kind of touched by those and influenced by those kind of narratives and logics. And so I think it's really important for us to kind of keep the conversation going within our communities, to remember our own histories, and to be kind of, actually, we were subjected to those same things previously, and how do we kind of challenge and resist those now, and don't just kind of absorb them now. And I think that the migration piece is going to be one of the key fights for us, because I think that where kind of the government wants to throw migrants under the bus and pretend we're just throwing them under the bus, it's them we don't like. Actually, if we allow, and this is where individuals, community groups, unions need to be talking about the migration piece and the anti-migrant rhetoric, because migration isn't the problem. Migration has always actually been the solution. It's always been the solution. Yeah. Migrants have come because there's been a need. And so I think I would really kind of like to see us being able to kind of challenge the kind of rhetoric that the government has kind of, and successive governments have allowed to become the norm, and for us to be part of the conversation to challenge that, both within our communities and then outside of our communities.
And what's next for you? What's next for Runnymede Trust? How can people get involved, engage with the work that you're doing? Because I think for some people, unfortunately, this might be the first time they're hearing, and I might have said that before, but this might be the first time they're hearing about you, but that doesn't mean that you're any less impactful than their favourite TikTok influencer. You're more so impactful, but people need to find you and need to know like how they can get involved. So is there any initiatives that
so we I mean, obviously kind of our work isn't as sexy as most of those kind of TikTok influencers that you're talking about, right? But it's important work. And I think that in many ways, even if you don't know that your life has been impacted by it, whether it's your education, whether it's policing, whether it's kind of labour market conditions and wages, we've written, researched and done policy influencing around it, and hopefully at some level kind of touched and made sure that something has been improved as a result of it. So even if you don't know the Runnymede Trust directly, I hope that the work that we've been doing for decades now will have kind of been part of the ecosystem that people live in. But I think more directly, I'm really excited that we do the policy influencing work in terms of what's the conversation now, what are we trying to protect our communities from. But we also do the kind of really bold, brave thought leadership work, which is about where should we be, right, and what should we be aiming for, not just kind of trapped in this conversation where we're forever defending ourselves. And so one of the most exciting pieces of work that we've got coming up is talking about reparations. Okay. And that's again treated as a wild conversation. Of course, we're not going to pay this huge sum of money to X, Y, and Z. And it's like, that's not what reparations is. Reparations can be that, but it's actually much bigger than that. It's about thinking about the relationship between kind of our history and our geography. It's thinking about climate justice. It's thinking about wealth redistribution here in the UK right here and now. And so I'm really excited, and this is the beauty of being the chief exec of Runnymede Trust, is I get to be able to say, yeah, I really want to do this, and kind of bring in the money and bring in the support. And when we do this, there will be public events around it. There will be kind of conversations that people can get involved in. And we exist to energize people. We can't do the work alone. We're a tiny organization. So we do our research. We kind of do our kind of put the output there. And then we rely on other people to take that up and kind of move with it in the spaces that that they're influential and impactful in. And so it's that kind of, the ecosystem model. Like, we give and we hope that people will take it and then kind of, move it forward.
Cool, perfect. Instagram handle, social media handles. Can you tell us what they are?
Oh, I don't know them. I'm so sorry. You'll have to put them on.
Yeah, we'll put them up. So last couple of words, sentences. What do you want viewers to take away? What do you want to kind of lasting message to be?
I think that often we sit in this space and feel really bleak and feel like, God, it's so hard. And it is really, really hard. I also feel like there is so much energy, and there's almost, we're incentivized to despair and to sit in that space and just think that there's nothing we can do. But actually, it's 5 years on from George Floyd's murder, and I think that there was so much energy, so many people that were inspired by that. And that lives on. I think that lives on, and that energy and that intellectual kind of energy is still there. And I think there are so many people your age and younger who will have kind of been inspired by that. So I think that it feels hard. It is hard, but I think that there are so many people working in different spaces to kind of to challenge, to resist, and to imagine something that's significantly different.
Last point now. Sorry, I know I keep saying last point, but you said something about George Floyd. One of the things I speak about when people speak about George Floyd, I say there have been, even in the UK, there have been, I think, about 1,400 people that have died as a result of police custody, in the prison system since 1900. Right? George Floyd murder was at a crucial time. It was COVID. Everyone was at home. There was no distractions. So that was center. That was the center of social media. That was what we had, social media and the TV to kind of get us through, the Boris Johnson's announcements, etc. Is it going to take another situation like George Floyd, like Black Lives Matter, to center race, to center class, to center social injustices in a way that we need it to kind of push this, to kind of to give the diversity inclusion agenda the focus that it needs?
Yeah, I think that, like you said, that it brought forensic attention because there was little else going on, but also loads going on at the same time. But it kind of focused our attention at that time. I want to say not, though, because I think that that makes it feel like there isn't activity happening all the time. And I think there is activity happening all the time. The world looks in and sees it at particular moments when these horrific things happen. But I think there are people, like you said, individuals, community organisations, grassroots activists, us, trade unions who are working on these issues all the time. It's just the world doesn't pay attention to it. And I think that they are moments that kind of mobilise perhaps a wider group of people to come into it. Some of that doesn't stick and most of the people move on. But they're always the people who are kind of the hardcore committed people.
And it always has been.
And it always has been, yeah.
Cool, perfect. Well, Shabna, great conversation. Really, really appreciate your time. Viewers, like, subscribe. Until next time, thank you very much. Shabna, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.